Welcome to episode 10 of this Skyrim Donuts tutorial series. Today we will finish what we started in the last video, which is texturing our model. We got the donut dough parts all done, and now we need to do the icing, sprinkles, and the plate, and then export all of the final texture files. This video may be less intense than the last one, I hope, but it's still going to be really long, so take a deep breath and let's get going. Click on the Donuts layer set so that when we add a new layer, it won't go into one of the existing groups. Then click the plain square up here to add a solid layer. This is going to be the pink icing like I have on my Blender donuts. So I'll double click and rename it Icing Pink. Then I'll add a matte ID by clicking the little button down here, holding Q and clicking on the icing that I want to assign. Next, I'll change the albedo to a nice pink shade. I used a hex value of 804B82, and it needs to be shiny, so I'll set the roughness a bit darker to a value of 828282. Now, this looks really vivid here in Mixer, I'll note, but the color's going to end up lighter and probably less intense by the time it gets to Skyrim. Now we do the same thing to color the other icings. Duplicate this layer and rename it to Icing Blue. Click the Matte ID box here in the layer, then hold Q and select the icing that you want to be blue. You'll note that this adds it to the pink one we already had selected, so over here on the right, just deselect the previous one so that only the new icing gets this layer. I'll then set the albedo to a pretty blue shade. This one's a hex value of 2B5F7C. And then for just a little variation, I'll put the roughness of this one at a value of 808080. Using Shift and the right mouse button, I'll pan the light around, and I think this icing is looking quite nice. Alright, I'm going to make all the rest of mine white, so I'll duplicate the layer once again and rename it to Icing White. Click the Matte ID box, hold Q, select the white icing parts, and deselect the previous one for the blue icing in the list on the right. White things can't be totally white or they're blinding, so you need to set the albedo to a light gray. In my case, I'm using a hex value of 727272. Now it looks really white in the viewport, but it's actually gray as you can see here. Let me set this back real quick to 727272. There we go. For the roughness, I'm going to change it a little bit by setting this value to 878787. So I think this looks good, but as suggested by one of my awesome viewers, we really need some chocolate icing. Now I did not account for this when we set up the vertex color for the material ID, but that's okay. We can actually do this using a paint mask. Let's start by duplicating the white icing layer and renaming it to Icing Chalk. I'm going to turn one of the white ones chocolate, so I'll just leave the matte ID as it is. First, I'm going to set the color for this layer, and I'll use a nice chocolatey brown for the albedo. The hex value here is 1E1009. And I'll just nudge the roughness down a smidge to a hex value of 767676. This chocolate layer is now overwriting all of the white icing, which is not what we want. So we're going to add a paint mask to hide the donuts from this layer that should remain white. And this is done just like we did in the last video. Right-click on this layer and add paint mask. As I did before, I like to work on the 2D image when masking these donuts out, but before I swap over, let's just take note of which donut this is. It's got vanilla dough, chocolate icing, and long sprinkles. Okay, in the 2D view, which corresponds to our UV map, I'll note which donut needs to stay chocolate. And then I'll choose a square brush, resize it, make sure the color is set to black, and paint over all the other chocolate icing donuts to block them from this layer. You can see the final result here by hitting 9 to get to the layer mask view. Now remember, if you aren't sure which donut is which, you can use the Material ID view, swap between the 2D and 3D views, or just paint directly on the 3D model if you prefer. Now once that's done, we have all of our icing finished. Go ahead and save the file now. I like to use Save As to keep different versions. Now we need to organize again, so hold Shift and select all the icing layers. Hit Ctrl G to put them in a group, and then double-click to rename this group to icing. Alright, the sprinkles are next. Select the donuts layer set. Again, this is only so we don't create a new layer inside one of the groups, and then add a solid layer. Double-click and rename this one Metal Silver. Click the button to add a material ID, and then hold Q and select one of the sparse sprinkle sets, and I'm going to go with this bright orange matte ID. We're going to try making some of these metallic, just like we did in the Blender Guru tutorial. But I have to warn you that metal in Skyrim is difficult, and these aren't even real metal, so they might be even more difficult. But we're going to give this a whirl anyway. Now I'm going to make these silver, so I'll set the albedo to 999999. Then I'll select the color dot for metalness, which is a map we haven't used yet, and I'm going to turn it all the way white. For metalness, you will almost always use either all black, which is 0, or all white, which is 1, because objects are generally either metal or not metal, and it's super rare for them to be anything in between. For roughness, we can use the entire white-black spectrum since metal can be rough or shiny. I want these sprinkles to be pretty shiny, so I'm going to turn the roughness way down to a hex value of 5E, 5E, 5E. And by the way, this messiness you can see around the edges we're going to talk about in a bit. I know it's not brilliant, but just ignore it for now. Now duplicate this layer for the next set and rename it to Metal Red. Select the matte ID, untick the previous selection, then hit Q and pick another set of very sparse sprinkles, like these bright red ones that I have here. For these metallic red ones, I'm going to pick a nice medium dark red albedo color. This was a hex value of 8C0B0D. I'll leave the metalness all white and put the roughness at still a very shiny value of 5F, 5F, 5F. And I think I want to tweak this red just a bit. So I'm going to change the albedo to a new value of 81090B. And yeah, that looks good. Okay, the yellow sprinkles are next. Duplicate this layer and rename it yellow. Select the matte ID, untick the previous selection, then hit Q and pick the set you want to be yellow. It so happens that I have a yellow matte ID to use, so I'll pick that. These are not going to be metal, so I'll turn the metalness all the way back to black. And I'll set the albedo to 9C871F and turn the roughness down a little more to 464646. I think these sprinkles should be a matte shiny, a little shinier than the icing, but not looking like metal or plastic. Now the color looks kind of wild right now, but it is going to end up a little different in Skyrim. So I'll note here that it's hard to replicate Skyrim's shader system outside of the game. It's going to take some practice and a bit of trial and error to learn how it needs to look here in order to look the way you want in the game. If your software supports importing HDRIs, then I suggest playing around with these to find a good replica. If not, just do your best with the lighting settings that are available to you. Okay, let's duplicate this yellow sprinkle layer for the next color. I'm going with green next. I'll select a new matte ID, then change the albedo to 38672A, and for a little variation, I'll use 454545 for the roughness. And I don't like that green, so I'm going to tweak this a little bit more. The final hex value I went with was 2E5A21. Okay, 2 more to go. Duplicate the green layer, rename it, and I'm doing blue this time, and select the next material ID. For these blue sprinkles, I set the albedo to 265285, and I put the roughness at 434343. The last set will be pink, so we duplicate one more time, rename it to pink, and select the last unused material ID. Now I want this pink to be different enough from the pink icing so that it will stand out. So let's give it an albedo value of 742176 and a roughness value of 535353. Now this looks pretty good, but you'll notice that I have a lot of artifacting around my sprinkles. You can see here in the layer mask view that we don't have very clean lines around the sprinkles. And it's also not brilliant around the edges of the icing. Now I believe this has to do with the quality of the material ID map. We're just going to use some workarounds to make this look a little better. Remember that by assigning a material ID, we are excluding all other parts from being affected by a given layer. So if we look at one of the icings, you can see where the sprinkles are excluded since they are colored in black. Normally this would be a good thing, but because we don't have clean edges on the material ID map, there are pixels in these masks where nothing is being applied. And so our solid gray layer at the very bottom of the stack is what we see coming through. To fix this, we're going to use a paint mask on the icings to unhide the sprinkle parts. The end result is that instead of the gray showing through, the underlying icing will be seen instead. Now I think this will make a lot more sense when you see it, so let's just do it. Select an icing layer and right-click to add a paint mask. I'm going to use the 2D view again, but you can paint there on the 3D model if you prefer. This time we want to unhide something, which means we need to paint white over it. Go down to the brush color and turn this all the way white. And again, sorry that my overlay is in the way. Then pick a brush type, the circle is a pretty good one for this, and change the size. And then paint white over all the black colored sprinkles on the image. Be a little careful with this. You don't want to mess up the edges of the icing. When it's all done, go back to the 3D model and check the PBR view. Now, instead of the gray outline around the sprinkles, we have the pink icing color. If you turn the paint mask on and off, you can see how the gray versus the pink looks. It's not perfect, but I think it's better and it's good enough for now. Okay, let's do the same thing for the rest of the icings. Select the next one, add a paint mask, and then paint white over all the black sprinkles. I'm going to speed this part up so that you don't have to sit here and watch me do this really boring stuff. Just remember to be careful and don't stray outside the lines at all or you're going to mess up your icing. Now here you can see how this has worked pretty nicely for the blue. When that layer is done, do the next icing. It's the same deal. Add a paint mask, paint white over the black sprinkles, and don't go outside the lines. You can change the shape and size of the brush as needed, and if you zoom in and out, the brush size stays the same, which can be pretty handy or possibly annoying depending on what you're trying to do. Just repeat this process until you've added a similar paint mask to all of your icing layers. I'll note here that my computer lagged hard while I was doing this. If yours does too, just be patient and do your best. Try turning off all the other layers except the icings. And you can turn the resolution in the Setup tab to 2048 or lower. You can also adjust other settings here in the Display and Performance tabs to help it render faster. If you already have a paint mask for a layer, like I do for the chocolate icing, just select it and paint white over the sprinkles. And voila! This may not be a perfect solution, but I think it's a pretty decent one. These look much better to me now. Alright, now let's fix the gray peeking through where the icing meets the donut. The workaround I'm going to use for this is simple. Instead of having that layer be gray, we'll make it a color that better matches the donut dough. Before we do that, let's organize. Select all the sprinkle layers with Shift-click, and then Ctrl-G to put them into a folder. Double-click and rename it to Sprinkles. And now it's a good time to save again. Alright, let's fix this icing issue. If we delete the bottom surface layer completely, we can still see a bit of a line here that doesn't belong. So let's change the color instead. Select that gray surface layer and change its albedo to something light brown. I went with a hex value of 643821. Now this looks better for the vanilla donuts, but it's not quite right for the chocolate ones. So let's duplicate that layer to make one specifically for the chocolate. drag and drop it into the chocolate donuts folder. Now to exclude all the vanilla donuts from this layer, add a paint mask. And then paint black over all the vanilla donuts. I'm doing this again in 2D view, but remember, you can paint in the 3D view if you like. Now the chocolate donuts are the ones with the rougher dough texture, so I can easily tell what is what by looking at this image. Don't forget that you can change to other views as needed. For example, once I've isolated the parts by looking at the PBR view, I can switch to Layer Mask to quickly clean up the rest of the mask. Then I'm going to move this layer to the bottom of the chocolate donuts, and I will edit its albedo so the color is a better match for the chocolate dough. I used a dark brown, which had a hex value of 1A0C05. And here we have it. Stacks of yummy donuts, ready to rejuvenate your Dragonborn on their quest for glory. But wait, these most delicious of delicacies deserves a delightful plate to rest upon. So we need to tackle the last part of our model. Now I decided I wanted a rugged ceramic look, kind of like this reference photo, but I wanted a different color and not quite so chipped around the edges. I'm also going to make mine a slightly muted dark blue color. Now for full disclosure, I struggled more than I expected with this plate, and it kind of took on a life of its own, which you'll see as we work through this. I'm going to do this part quickly, so please pause and/or slow down the video as needed. First, let's organize. Close up our chocolate donuts folder, move the bottom solid layer into the vanilla donuts folder, and then make sure it's at the very bottom of that stack. Now, you should already have a layer set for the plate, but since I loaded a save before having that done, I gotta do it now. I'll just add a new layer set, double-click to rename it, and then tick only the box for plate since I want this new texture set to apply to just the plate. To start off, I wanted some kind of rough surface because even if it's glazed ceramic, it has a roughness underneath that. The available ceramic was all too smooth for my liking, so I decided to borrow a soil texture instead. With the plate layer set selected so that our new layer will be added there, I'll click the button for Add Surface Layer, and I'm going to choose the first soil mud that comes up on the list. Double-click on that layer and rename it to Plate Base. Set the scale to 6, and I think that looks pretty okay. Then I'm going to change the albedo to a grayish blue. This was a hex value of 3E3F51. And then I'll turn the albedo contrast down to around 0.5 to tone that down because we're going to make our own little speckles that will hopefully be better for a ceramic plate than what came in this soil albedo. Next, here in the height frequency settings, I'm going to turn the low frequency down to about -0.3 to greatly reduce the lumpy bumps. And finally, I'll turn the roughness down to around CB to give it some shine. Now let's isolate just the plate by going to the visibility options here and clicking on the little eye for donuts to turn them off. This plate looks way too uniform, so we need to add some color variation. First, let's add some darker areas. Add a solid layer and rename it to Variety Dark. Set the albedo to a nice dark blue, not too saturated, something like 0E1025, and leave the roughness as default. Now, of course, this colors the entire plate, which we don't want, so we need a mask. Right-click to add Mask Stack, and then add a Perlin Noise mask. Tweak the settings however you want. I ended up with an amplitude of 1, frequency 3, octaves 2, lacunarity 1.5, and persistence 0.5. Now let's do some lighter color variation. Duplicate the dark layer and rename it Variety Light. Set the albedo to around 434556 and leave the roughness as it is. We can use the same noise mask and just change the seed so that we get a new randomization. And then I tweaked the options down to an amplitude of 1, frequency 2.5, octaves 2, lacunarity 2.3, persistence 0.5. And then I actually thought this looked better when I inverted the black and white areas by ticking this invert box here. Now this color is still quite strong, so in the albedo map drop-down, I'm going to turn the opacity down to about 0.54. Looking at the reference, I liked the darker coloration all around the rim of the plate here, so I wanted to try to recreate that. I duplicated the Variety Light solid layer and renamed it to Dark Rim. Then I set the albedo opacity back to 1 and gave it a color of 10111A. The roughness I left alone. For the mask stack, I don't want the noise, so I'm going to right-click on that layer and delete it. Now I will add a position gradient instead, and I'll set this to above. And wow, here we can see by these little triangle artifacts that I'm being haunted by some poorly executed parts of the earlier workflow, probably something I didn't do brilliantly in the models themselves. Now if you intend to have a high-quality finished product, you'll want to diagnose and fix problems like this when they show up. And while I fully admit that this isn't great, for the sake of our time and our sanity, we're going to pretend like this isn't here. Triangles? What triangles? I don't see any triangles. Okay, on this position gradient, I'm going to change the range to about 0.198 on the low end and 0.238 on the high end, just enough to make those artifacts disappear. I mean, artifacts? What artifacts? Now I want this darker rim area to have a nice, smooth transition, so I will add a modifier by clicking the 3 little pinhead lines up here, and I'll choose a bevel. I want this to be quite wide, and a setting of 4 with blending mode at normal worked pretty well. But I still want this darker rim area to be wider, and I can do that with a projection modifier. If I select that from the modifier options, and then set it to freeform, I can leave blending mode as normal and everything at 0, and then set the scale to 0.9, and this now covers the area that I want. Looking at the PBR view, I think the effect is a bit too strong, so I'll go into the albedo drop-down and turn the opacity of this layer down to about 0.8. Looking at the reference again, I like this line of lighter color around the inner crease of the plate. To make that, I'll duplicate the Variety Light layer, drag and drop it to the top of the stack, and rename it to Highlights. The albedo, I'll put at a value of around 797A8B, and I'll set the opacity back to 1 for now. Roughness I'll turn down to a value of CA for a little bit more shine. For the mask stack, I'll delete the noise and instead add a curvature. Nope, there's no triangles here. I don't know what you're talking about. I want cavities only, so I pick that in the drop-down. And remember, you can hit 9 on your keyboard to see the layer mask that's being applied. And then I'll put the tightness at 0, and I'll leave the levels at 0 to 1. Hit 1 for PBR view. This looks nice, but it's a bit too strong, so I'm going to turn the albedo opacity down to about 0.63. I think this is looking okay, and we're almost done, but since I'm going for a more ceramic look, it really needs all these little black speckles. Now I had a wild time trying to figure out how to do this, and what I'm going to show you is a little crazy, but it worked okay. For the record, I'm sure there's an easier way to do this. I just started throwing masks on top of masks with modifiers flying around like confetti on New Year's Eve. But after 3 or 4 attempts at this plate, I finally hit upon this approach. Now I did not have a plan before I started, and you don't need one either when you're texturing. Just experiment. Once you start to get an idea of what the different components and modifiers do, then it will get easier. And don't be afraid to try things, no matter how wacky it seems. Experimentation can lead to some really cool results. Okay, for these speckles, we're going to start off with yet another solid layer by clicking the plain little square up here. Double-click to rename this layer Speckles. Set the albedo to full black, which is 000, and put the roughness around E5. Now we get crazy with our masks. Right-click and add Mask Stack. Then in the components, add a pattern and select Checker. Hit 9 so you can see the masks in action. These are obviously way too big, so change the X and Y repeats both to 50. We want to turn these little checkers into random speckles instead. First, let's add a scatter modifier on top. Leave it at random, and then change the density to 10. For the blending mode, change it to distort, and leave the intensity at 0.1. Now I want little white speckles on my mask, which will turn into black speckles in the final PBR, so I'm going to throw an invert modifier on top of this, and then I'll set that to a blending mode of min. Next, to improve this, I add a blur modifier. Change the blending mode to add, then leave it set to Gaussian and put the strength at 0. The speckles are still too small, and I don't know the best way to make them bigger, but what I did was add 2 more blur modifiers on top of the stack, and I set them both to add as the blending mode. So I'll duplicate the first blur, just as it is, by right-clicking and selecting Copy Component, then right-clicking and selecting Paste as New. I left everything as is for that one. Now I duplicate it again by right-click Copy, right-click Paste as New, and this time I change the strength to 0.01. I can add a little more punch to the white areas by using a brightness contrast modifier. So I click the 3 little pinhead lines and choose Brightness Contrast from the list. Then I set the brightness to 1 and the contrast to about 3. Finally, the speckles seem a little too blurry, so I will top everything off with a Posterize modifier, which is kind of like a reverse bevel. It sharpens the lines of the gradient, or it will remove the gradient altogether if you set it high enough. For my Posterize, the default value of 2 seemed fine, but I needed to set the blending mode to add. Now if I hit 1 on the keyboard for PBR view, I think this looks pretty okay for ceramic sprinkles. Let's finish it off by giving it an overall glaze, like ceramics often have. I'll just add 1 more solid layer by clicking the little square up here, turn off everything except roughness, and turn that down to around 8F, 8F, 8F. Now just like with our donuts, I don't want the glaze to be 100% uniform, so I will change the blending mode here to multiply. Now it's subtle here for the plate, but multiply will preserve the little bit of detail that we have here in this plate from all of the different layers. And there we go. So this isn't perfect, but this is a good example to remind you of something that I've said in at least one previous video. Don't think you're going to get by with stuff that's wrong. Problems will magnify as you go through the workflow, and by the end, something you thought was just a small issue can turn into a really big one that will ruin your final model. Now let's bring our donuts back by selecting the visibility drop-down and clicking the eye back on. And then let's just name our last layer here, Plate Glaze, so we can keep track of things. Alrighty, for the purpose of this tutorial and for the sake of moving on, I think this looks pretty good. And now we need to get these textures out of Mixer and into Skyrim. So before we call it quits for today, we need to export all these texture maps that we've worked so hard to create. Let's save the file now, and as per my usual practice, I'm going to save it as a new version. Now before we export, it's very important to go ahead and render the model with textures in the same resolution that you want to export. For example, if you're going to export as 4K textures, go into the Setup tab and change the texture resolution here to 4K, and then wait while it re-renders your scene in the new resolution. If you only change it in the Export tab, your images may not come out the way you want. This is what happens to me, you'll see in a minute. The one tab we haven't talked about yet here is the Export tab. Click on that now and let's walk through this. The export target for your model's texture maps is Custom. For export location, click the little folder and choose where you want to put them. I'm making a folder here where I was saving the 3D models and I'm calling it Mixer Maps. I like to untick the box for Create Subfolder and tick the box for Open Folder after export, but you can choose whatever you want there. For the model, we don't need to export this, we already have our game-ready model. In the Texture section, select the Metalness Maps preset and then click on the little line below the Texture preset dropdown that says Advanced Textures setup. Here we will first delete the maps that we don't need. So, click the little trash can next to Gloss, Displacement, Opacity, and Emission. Click the little arrow to expand the albedo section. The settings here are good, and we don't need RGBA, which includes alpha for transparency, so RGB is fine because we have no transparent parts in our textures. Expand roughness and change RGB to grayscale since Skyrim needs this map to be in black, white, and shades of gray. Expand normal and tick the box for invert normal Y. This is the swizzle that we talked about before, and as a reminder, Skyrim uses DirectX, which is -Y, versus OpenGL, the default export setting, which is +Y. For AO, expand that and change RGB to grayscale. And finally, expand metalness and change RGB to grayscale. Like roughness, we need the AO to be black, white, and shades of gray, and metalness will typically just be black and white. For the rest of the settings, you can leave them as the mixer defaults. Don't be tempted to change any of these to 16-bit, especially the albedo. 8-bit is fine, and it will work best for combining our maps into the format Skyrim requires. So for this model, the only maps that we needed were albedo, roughness, normal, AO, and metalness. But wait, you might say, I know that we need a gloss map and a specular map for Skyrim, so I'm just going to export those too. Well, you're correct in that we will need those maps, but I don't advise exporting either of them from Mixer. We will be making a specific gloss map ourselves, which is very easy to do by just inverting the roughness. And the Mixer specular map, in my experience anyway, is just totally wrong for Skyrim. If you would like to save these export settings as a preset so you don't have to change them every time, just click the little paper icon here and select Save As. Give it a name like Skyrim Maps and hit Save. Then click on the Texture Sets tab. For the donuts, choose the resolution you want the texture files to have and make sure these 5 maps are ticked. I like to export in 4K textures, which is almost certainly overkill for Skyrim, but then I downsize later because I feel like this gives me the maximum flexibility. But you can export as 2K if you want. This might even be preferable. Select the plate texture set and make sure that it looks the way you want as well. Then click the little X to close that pop-up window when you're done. Check down here at the bottom to make sure everything looks correct. 5 maps, PNG, 8-bit. 2 texture sets, each one with 5 maps at whatever resolution you picked. If that looks good, then click on Export to Disk. Mixer will do some stuff, but it should finish pretty quickly, and you can see what it's doing down here in the corner. If you ticked the Open Folder After Export box, then you'll know when it's done because a window should pop up. If things don't look right the first time, for example, my textures came out in 2K even though I set them to export as 4K, my first suggestion is to make sure you change the texture resolution in the Setup tab to the same resolution you are exporting. After you change it, wait a few minutes and make sure Mixer has re-rendered the scene using that new resolution. Now match your export settings to that resolution and try again. The other things you can try are just exporting again because sometimes Mixer seems a little confused and needs a practice run. You can also try exporting each texture set one at a time. And remember to double check all of your settings and don't ever export the albedo as 16-bit linear. And with all that, we're actually finished texturing. You should now have a collection of images for both the donuts and the plate that look something like this. Skyrim can't actually use these texture files, so in our next video we're going to combine and convert them so that they are ready for the game. If you've gotten this far, you deserve a medal for your patience and perseverance. Thanks so much for sticking it out, and I'll see you again soon for our next episode. Bye!